if you just look at the state of the mainstream media or things like this, you would be completely pessimistic and you say it's just completely hopeless. The thing that's countervailing or at least moderating that is that it's been in such decline and it just doesn't dominate the discourse in the way that it did 20, 25 years ago. It's very messed up. If it was up to the mainstream media, the country would be completely lost. Fortunately, it's still very powerful. Fortunately, it's not quite as omnipotent as we sometimes make it out to be. They skew things in a partisan way in this country. On the other hand, they hated Mr. Trump in a completely deranged way, and it was not enough to stop him from winning. So that was it was a manifestation of just how weak the media is that they couldn't stop Trump in 2016. There's a way in which the derangement, it always backfires. People know that the media is biased and they discount it appropriately. I don't think it changes, but yeah, so I think if you look at things like the New York Times or CNN, they were biased in a liberal way already in the 1980s, and they're complete one-party state organs at this point. So they're much worse than they were 30 years ago. Any way you try to measure these things objectively, but they're also somewhat weaker. They can't quite control the discourse because everybody understands that they're biased, and so they're constantly undermining themselves. It's like teenage girls into cutting or something like this. It's just pathologically self-destructive. And so there is something about them it's deranged, but it's also, we shouldn't exaggerate how powerful they are. And even that, we shouldn't exaggerate. We shouldn't overstate CNN. I mean, there's sort of straightforward things you can do. There's some way in which you just cover both sides. You just let both sides talk. It's not the bias in media is not in how topics are presented. It's what topics you even select. It's how certain things we don't cover. It's certain things you probably if you talk about the question of whether the CCP is a problem for the U.S., just raising the question is almost an answer, and then we end up just not talking about certain types of questions, and so that's I think CNN, all these places would correct it if we just had a debate. If we just corrected it, just having the debate, our side will win. I think there are all these debates about diversity, identity politics that are kind of crazy, but I wonder whether they are also distractions from, again, communist China. Let's just posit that every single one of these debates is a distraction from communist China. There are race problems in this country, and there is a debate we need to have about racism, and there's something we need to do about the history and overcome that. But if we only talk about that and talk about nothing else, that's somehow doing the CCP's bidding. And I worry that this is when I was an undergraduate at Stanford in the late 80s, and I was involved in all these campus wars, culture wars. I started a conservative student newspaper, the Stanford Review. I wrote an anti-political correctness book in the mid-90s, The Diversity Myth. I think there was a way in which the conservatives were right about all the issues. And yet I worry that it was somehow the wrong thing to focus on, and that we were missing the elephant in the room, which I would say at this point is something like the Chinese communist goal to take over the world or something like that. And so if we're talking about identity politics, it's an endless maze. It's the word identity means that which makes you identical, that which makes you the same, and that which makes you unique, that what makes you different. So identity means both same and different. And so when you start with a word that means A and not A, you can go in any crazy direction you want. It's an endless maze of derangement.
If I were king of the world, not queen, not duke, not earl, all I would do is talk about the Chinese Communist Party. I spent half of the show this morning that I'm talking to you with Deb Fisher on our strategic competition weaponry. We're falling behind their ICBM production, their submarine production. I talked to Gallagher about the balloon. I would talk about it all the time because I agree with you profoundly. But most Americans, this is not a left-right issue, they don't want to talk about it or think about it. Whereas China controls what their people talk about and think about all the time. So turning, because I don't want to abuse your time, to domestic politics. You played in the Republican politics generally for the last 10 years. Is the party producing candidates that are serious about the Chinese Communist Party? Jim Banks in Indiana is serious about the Chinese Communist Party. Mike Gallagher is serious about the Chi-Coms. Generally, is the Republican Party serious about it?
It's more serious than it was 10, 20 years ago, but I don't know, it's a very, very slow moving super tanker or something. It's just very slow to shift. We're getting more serious. I worry that it's a very slow process. There are all these ways we can criticize President Trump for being the best vehicle, but then, the alternatives were sort of, there's a lot that was wrong with Paul Ryan. He was never that critical of China. Or if you think of Mitch McConnell as sort of the passive aggressive nihilism that is Mitch McConnell, it's not good on China. So again, if you sort of evaluate some of the alternatives on the China question, they were always quite bad. And there are things that are good about McConnell, like he stops tax hikes, and that's
he got the Supreme Court. He saved the Constitution, Peter. You took con law at Stanford. He saved the Constitution by holding open the vacancy of Scalia. He got Trump elected by doing so. I always defend Mitch to Donald Trump when he's on the program, because you wouldn't have won if he had let the Scalia vacancy be filled by Merrick Garland, and we could kiss our First Amendment goodbye if the left got control of the court the way that they wanted to get control of the court.
I would argue that the Supreme Court is still the least important branch. We need to be doing some legislation and some executive action in dealing with China, and that's where McConnell's been quite. That's where there still isn't really an alternative. If you look at the 2022 midterm elections, where it was very disappointing how pathetically the Republicans did, and there's a lot of blame to go around. I think my critique is we did not run on anything. We did not have strong agenda. And basically, if the best argument you had was that you're stopping Biden judicial appointments, that's not enough to win. That's just a very
you're right.
To run,
Particularly since we own the court now for 10 years. It's a conservative majority. That won't work anymore. Peter, I want to close.
Hugh, we don't own the court. We just